for Premier. We will resume the questioning, and I would call on Mr. Jacobson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today, Mr. Chair, I'm going to bring up something near and dear to my heart and people back home as my elders. We have to start taking better care of our elders in regards to long-term care facilities. We have elders all in regional centres. We have elders from the Nutput in Hay River, Inuvik, Yellowknife that need to be brought home. It's just like decentralizing our elders. That's what's got to be done. I'm asking here today, with working with a partnership with our premiers, our potential premiers here, how could we bring our elders home and making partnerships with our community corporations in each community that I represent? You know, it's to train our local people to take care of our own. It's a rippling effect to families. You never see your elder when they leave the communities because the cost of flights. Sax Harbor return flight to Inuvik is $1,500. Ulakaktuk, $2,008. Polituk, $1,260. Return flight to see our elders. Only time you'll see your elders when you're going on a medical or something comes up. It's not right. I want our elders to be brought home and to build in Ulakaktuk a 4 or 6 bed facility in Tuk, Ulu, and Polituk. Now please help me help you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobson. The order for answering this question will be Mr. Simpson, Ms. Martselos, Ms. Cochran, and Mr. Lafferty. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you for the question. You know, I'm very familiar with long-term care centers. My Nan has been living in one now for 12 years, and she's lucky. She has a big family in Hay River, and she gets visits all the time, every day. It's strange if someone doesn't visit her during the day. But there are people in that same facility from a few communities away, and they don't get any visitors. And you can tell that weighs on them. And it's a big impact on your quality of life. As to building a long-term care center in those communities, I'm not sure what the requirements are. I know they always say you need a doctor. You need a doctor present. I'm not sure if that's the case. But one thing that we can do is fill that gap between people living on their own and people entering long-term care. And that includes things like home care. You know, if we have much more home care in the communities, you could have years, 5, 10 years more in your own home. If we have better programs in terms of housing so that people can get ramps in their homes. In Hay River, there was a couple, I think 92 and 93 years old. The housing said, no, you can't get a ramp to your house. You know, we're trying to keep people in their own homes. We're trying to keep people out of long-term care, and we're making it difficult for ourselves. So those are the kind of things that need to happen. You know, a commitment to build 3 long-term care centers. Obviously, I can't do that. You know, but I'm sympathetic to this, and I realize that it's there's value beyond the dollar value in keeping people in their own home. There's the cultural value. You know, it's not just the elders who are missing their family. It's the family who don't get to you know, see their elders, see you know, talk to them, learn from them. So you know, this is an issue, and it's one of those big issues facing the territory that we don't seem to have a plan for, other than, as one of my colleagues from the last assembly said, seniors warehousing units, which are essentially the big long-term care centers. So I look forward to working with everyone. I look forward to discussing this at the priorities setting meetings and seeing what kind of solution we can come to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Martselos.
I'm very sympathetic to the cause, because it's our elders that paved the way for all of our journeys, and we have to respect that. And I know there are situations throughout the territories, not only with long-term care, but because we have a situation like that also in our own community. We have a person here in Yellowknife who has been here for dialysis, and it's such a long ways for his family to come, and it's a major, major problem. and there's dialysis in Hay River, and there seems to be a problem for him to move from Yellowknife to Hay River, and at least then the family could come to visit on weekends or spend time with him. And it's a major issue, and I think that as a government that we have to look at these issues and try to resolve them so that because our elders gave so much, and then we take them away from the family, and they have so much knowledge to offer to the cultural aspect of the family and the community, and it's a major problem. And we seriously, as a group, have got to look at that. It's not only an issue for the family, it's an issue for the community, and it's an issue for all of us that are sitting around this table.
Thank you, Ms. Ms. Barcelos. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Long-term care is an issue. Taking care of our elders has been an issue. My degree is over 20 years ago, and when I went down south for my social work degree, they were telling us at that time, over 20 years ago, geriatrics is the way to go. Our population is aging, and you need to start taking care of them. 20-some years later, we're still in this situation where we're not doing appropriate. So, but I'm not, I stated in my speech, and people that know me know that I'm brutally honest and sometimes, and the reality is that I would love to be able to promise and say that in every small community we'll have long-term care beds in this assembly, but that would not be a reality. So I apologize for that, for not being willing to stand up here and lie. No, I'm not apologizing, I'm just being realistic. We have shortages of healthcare staff in every region, so we need to look at boosting up our staffing at the moment, what we have, before we can even expand and move any further with that. And I've said in my speech, we need a stronger recruitment and retention strategy to deal with that. But the other thing I heard in the member's comment was also working in partnership. And I have to say that in that region, the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation is actually really progressive in working towards actually training their people and stuff. So I think that there is options. We are moving into the Polytech University, hopefully. We will be looking at training our own northern people. And I think that if we work in partnerships with our Indigenous governments, that we'll actually be a lot more productive, we'll be more successful, and then hopefully it won't take us, because to train a nurse, you're looking at least 4 or 6 years, depending on the specialization, maybe longer. We don't have that time, so we need to work in partnerships together to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci. Mr. Chair, we need to be proactive on this particular subject. I totally agree that we need to bring our elders and seniors back home. And how do we do that? That's a question that we need to work out. I've been through that so many times as well in hospitals, where over the last 14 years as a member. And the elders, they just want to be home with their family. They just want to die peacefully at home, not in a hospital. And due to the fact that we've built regional seniors home, in particular in my region, Bishopcombe, that serves the outlying Clinchon region as well. But we need to go beyond that. And I believe Mr. Jacobson raised an issue where why couldn't we partner with community corporations? But they have brilliant ideas. They can come to our table and say, this is what we can build for you. Can you lease it back to JWT? And those are just some of the options that we can certainly work with. Partnership goes a long way, Mr. Chair. Promoting and also investing more in home care. We can do that immediately. Infrastructure will take some time, but we have programs in place already. Why couldn't we invest even more? We're investing in our people, in our elders and seniors. That will go a long way. And we're going to have happy faces on the elders in their community, with their family. So, Mr. Chair, this could be an easy solution as part of the programming, but with the infrastructure, obviously, we need to discuss amongst ourselves. But we've already got some facilities in the regions, capital centers in the regions, and also, to some degree, some in small isolated communities as well. but we do have programs that we can enhance in the small communities. Merci, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Lafferty. Next, I'll call on Ms. Cleveland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My constituents have trusted me to be accountable and in turn expect me to hold our leadership accountable. Therefore, how do you feel MLAs should measure personal performance excellence of a premier? And if you personally fell short, what would you do about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. The order for answering questions this time will be Ms. Cochran, Mr. Lafferty, Ms. Marcellos, and Mr. Simpson. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first order of actually holding your premier to account is, in my opinion, we're making speeches today. And so if we're making speeches and we're saying that we're committed, then we better be committed. And so I would be looking back on the speeches on a regular basis and seeing if we're doing it. There's other things that won't be in the speeches, and it's about the behaviors of premiers, of behavior of cabinets. I've said in my speech as well that we need to meet regularly with MLAs. MLAs, we need to work together. So if we're having what's called fireside chats or informal meetings, then issues should be brought to the premier's attention. And if the premier is not doing their job, then they need to be held to account on as well. And so hopefully the regular MLAs or cabinet would actually talk to their premier first and say, I have concerns. I've said communication is the key and we need to be able to do that. But we are accountable to the people. So it is not okay that people turn a blind eye to their premier, to their cabinet, to other members. We have to hold each other in check in our duties. We talked about change governments. Everybody said that. People are expecting better from us. They're expecting us to work better, to be professional in our duties. And if we're not, then there are mechanisms in place to actually take the premier out of the place. And I say that if a premier, whoever it may be, is not doing their duties and not fulfilling the speeches that they've made, then I would be the first one to say that MLAs should discuss it. All MLAs, including cabinet, and should be looking at putting the premier on the spot or taking the premier out of the spot. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Next, I'll turn to Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, obviously accountability should be forefront of our day-to-day business that we do as whether it be executive or regular members. And if there is performance issues, whether it be the premier or cabinet, or even the regular members, that we should hear about it immediately. And if the premier of the day has to deal with a minister that's not performing, or vice versa, premier, then regular members need to deal with that as well, because regular members have the power to take out the premier and the cabinet. But at the same time, if there's issues with cabinet, that premier needs to deal with it. And obviously there needs to be a communication dialogue constantly, fireside chats that we've had in 2 assemblies ago. And we didn't have much of that in a previous assembly, unfortunately, but we should have almost every session, there should be a fireside chat with the premier, a heads up to the executive that there are issues with some of the performance of ministers or whatever the case may be. And that needs to be acted immediately. And so if, let's say, if a regular member is having some issues with a minister, then I'd like to know immediately, right away, so I can deal with it. But if it's executive as a whole, then we need to discuss it as a caucus and come up with some solution there. So we've dealt with those kind of situations in the past. Where a minister has been taken out in the past through caucus, all 19 members. So there's an avenue there. And there's also code of conducts that we follow as well. We signed when we got elected as MLA. So we do have procedures that we need to follow. And we do have strict guidelines when you go into office of executive as well. There are rules and procedures that you have to follow and your performance as well. So Mr. Chair, I would look to members because accountability is a huge factor for me as well. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Marcellus.
My whole leadership has been about accountability. And I think that we had a code of conduct that we have to follow. We also have to ensure that we keep a high standard because we are the role models for all of the Northwest Territories, not only the people that are running for Premier, Cabinet, or the members of this House. I think that conflict of interest is extremely important, and we have to know that there are certain things that we can and cannot do, and we must make decisions that are completely ethical. Ethical decisions are extremely important, and I think part of that leadership has to be that if you see something that is not quite right, and if you're a leader, you got to call them on it. Sometimes it could be, you have to be able to call them and tell them that this is not a correct way of behaving, if it's behavior, or your performance is not up to par and your expectations, and if you have to share it with members of Cabinet and all the rest of the MLAs, I think it's up to a leader to do that, and that's the way it has to be handled. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marcellus. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and spoke extensively about this issue this morning, about how the Premier needs to take the role to keep ministers responsible. It is to keep ministers accountable. It's the entire Assembly that is tasked with that. But like I said, when it's everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility. In terms of the Premier keeping themselves accountable, I think that is where the lines of opening up the lines of communication come into play. I recommend regular meetings with the regular members, like fireside chats, regular meetings with the chair of PNP to discuss any sort of issues that are arising. And if there's corrections, then they need to be made. I mean, if the regular members say that, tell the Premier that he or she needs to do something differently, I mean, then you got to do something differently. You know, this is all about relationships. It's the Premier is not the Minister of Infrastructure. The Premier isn't the Minister of Health. Essentially, the Premier is the Minister of Relationships when it comes right down to it. Relationships among members, between governments, and with the public. And all that comes down to is communication. And earlier I was also advocating, and I think this was yesterday, I was advocating to some of the members. I said that if you don't fall into the trap that we did in the last Assembly, where we have a midterm review, and then you want to wait 2 years before you deal with accountability issues. Do what Nunavut did. They took their Premier out, right at the beginning of the Assembly almost. So, in addition to the Premier having to regulate themselves, I'm encouraging the members to take control of the power they have to ensure the accountability of the Premier as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, I'll go to Mr. Norm.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, during our roundtable, we heard a pretty loud chorus line or concert, if you will, about getting our land claims settled. And we didn't hear it just from any one. We heard it from a lot of different organizations. We've heard from our business community in the north to get our land claims settled. And they're not just saying they're screaming. Our economic health in the north as a whole is dependent on this. And so my question to our Premier candidates is, what specific commitments can you put in place to ensure that our outstanding land claims are settled during this Assembly? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Norm. The order for responding to this question will be Ms. Marcellus, Mr. Simpson, Mr. Lafferty, and then Ms. Cochran. Ms. Marcellus.
That was one of my priorities in my mandate, because being a former chief and realizing how important the Indigenous community contributes to our government and our Northwest Territories, and with outstanding land claims. And it's an issue all the time. And they said there was a lot of obstacles that were placed before them by the government of the Northwest Territories and by Canada, that we have to ensure that those land claims are a top priority so that this government can move forward for economic growth. The land claims will also bring wealth to the Northwest Territories in their regions, and it will give the Indigenous people a chance to be on even par with everybody else in the Northwest Territories in Canada. And I firmly believe that the faster we deal with this file, that the Northwest Territories will be able to move forward in the agenda of economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. This is sort of a difficult question to ask. I'm not familiar with the specifics at any of the tables. I can imagine what some of the outstanding issues are, but it's hard to make a specific commitment. But what I can commit to is to bring a different attitude to the table. Like I said earlier, we need to become uncomfortable. The government doesn't want to release power, and maybe even to us, it's uncomfortable to have that thought. But we need to get there. And we need to bring a different mandate. If we need to meet leader to leader, not through the lawyers to get things done, maybe that's what we have to do. I think nothing's off the table. We're closer with some negotiations than others, but to take a generation to negotiate a deal is unacceptable. So my commitment would be to take nothing off the table right off the bat and figure out how to get to yes. The government's response, I find, is often a no. That's the default response. Take that off the table. That is no longer the default response. Instead of a no, it's okay, how do we get to that point? We understand what you want, how do we get to that point? As opposed to no, we're not going to consider that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, clearly we heard from people yesterday, Aboriginal leadership. Indigenous leadership across the North have told us to settle the outstanding land claims. And all of us were there, and we need to start listening to those grassroots people. In my view, they are the experts when it comes to grassroots discussions, and we have our own staff that deals with them. I feel that we need to come to the table as elected officials, whether it be if I become a premier, sit down across from Grand Chief or the Chief to say, what is the real issue? What's outstanding? Let's put our backpack on the table and deal with it, and give direction to our bureaucrats to fix it, to resolve finalize our claim. In my view, it's supposed to be going that way, but it's not. There's stumbling blocks along the way. So we heard clearly yesterday, some of the groups want some breathing room. They want to deal with their own self-governing negotiation in the time being, and then bring GNWT to the table. We should respect that too. And so, as Member for Hay River alluded to, we need to come clean slate. This is a brand new government. And what's been happening in the past, well, that's in the past. In our language, it's what de go son. It means we need to move forward now. And so we're going to have a new mandate, a new action plan. We've been talking about land claims for the last 30, 40 years, especially those decho and ekecho. It's time for us to take on the action and move forward. We have 4 years to do that, Mr. Chair, and I'm a firm believer that we can successfully achieve that if we work in partnership with our Aboriginal partnerships across the Northwest Territories. Awesome.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Land claims are a priority, and self-government is a priority as well. The land claims will bring prosperity to all governments. It's going to bring pride to people, to Indigenous people, and it's going to bring investor confidence back in the Northwest Territories, which we need. So what I've heard all through all candidates today, and I really appreciate, is relationship, relationship, relationship. My experience as a cabinet member over the past 4 years was with the Indigenous governments, it was very structured. We'd only meet once or twice a year. Very structured agendas, no time for free talk. So I kind of bring it back, I like to bring it back to myself as a person. If somebody comes to my house and shows up at my door and says, I'm here and I have a reason, here I'm here, I'm going to deal with them quite differently than if they come and say, let's have a cup of tea and sit down and talk. And then a relationship builds and you can actually build that trust and talk. So I think it's bigger than just the negotiations. I think it's about building that trust and confidence within Cabinet as a whole within our Indigenous governments on how we relate with them, how many meetings we have. Just because agreements say that we'll meet twice a year is not acceptable that we only do that. We need to go out of our way to build those relationships with our Indigenous governments. And we need to think out of the box. So if we're sending in our departments, and what I'm hearing is that they're not working, things are not, they're stalled, people aren't building their trust, they're not feeling confident, then at that time ministers and the Premier need to get involved. We need to go sit with them and meet with them and talk to them in frankness and put up the concerns on the table and think outside the box. We are very structured. We're saying this is it. This is our offers. And sometimes those offers have to change. So I think that we need to make sure that we're fair to all Indigenous governments. We cannot be giving to one and not giving to all. We have conditions to deal with that. But if we're stuck with saying that this is all we're willing to put on the table, and we've been stuck for so many years, then it's time to bring more to the table. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. I will now call on Ms. Tom.
And collaborated with Indigenous groups within the Northwest Territories. At this time, we heard from most of the groups the importance of partnership and dialogue. Will the candidates for Premier tell us what were the top 3 priorities you heard yesterday? And the second question is, how do you go about honoring these priorities?
Thank you, Ms. Tom. The order for responding will be Mr. Lafferty, Mr. Simpson, Ms. Martselos, and Ms. Cochran. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci. Mr. Chair, ich gerade die
Yesterday, when we met with the Northern leaders, they discussed a lot of things, a lot of issues, and how well we can work together. And that word is trust, and also relationship building. How well can we work together, especially from the smaller communities? A lot of their issues are not addressed. So this is what we heard a lot. As the government here, the MLAs, and also later, the Premier and Executive will be in place. We want them to be honest to the people. That's the kind of advice we gotten from the Northern leaders, is to have trust and honesty amongst each other and have respect. Today, we don't have that. And another thing, in the English language, we call it decentralization. When we look at Yellowknife, it's getting bigger. And this, where we come from, smaller communities, we have less things to work with. It seems like we're just getting a little bit of trickle of funding. And that's what the chiefs in the smaller community has been addressing. I like to put that as a priority. If we put the smaller community first as a priority, everybody will flourish economically. When we look at it, we have a lot of issues, drugs and alcohol problems, housing issues. And that's what we call proper, poverty. So if we address these issues, we'll solve a lot of problems. And the third item, we have housing issues. There's a lot of concerns, and it seems the administration don't really understand our situation in the communities, and they seem to be hiding behind policies. They don't look at the community or travel the community to have first-hand information and to connect with the community. We need to review the policies and maybe make changes to suit the way our community situations are. If one person is having difficulties, we need to help that person. And this member is asking, we have a lot of other questions that are still coming. We're here to address some of these questions. But I think these three items are my most important one. And these are my priorities that I want to put in place. Merci.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Mr. Simpson.
There we go, thanks. I believe the question was, what are the top three priorities we heard yesterday at the meeting? And, I think we're all going to have very similar ones. Relationships was the biggest issue that we talked about, and that goes to the relationship between the government and Indigenous governments in terms of negotiating these land claim settlements. There was a lot of love around the room yesterday. It was a little different than some of the meetings I've been to with Indigenous governments over the past few years, but it was good. Everyone was very positive. Everyone saw a lot of hope with this assembly, and every single government there seemed to genuinely want better relationships with the territory, and I think that is what we need to do, is keep that going. That is the number one priority that came out of that. Implementation was the other one that was discussed quite a bit. Once a claim is settled, once a self-government agreement is settled, then there's the implementation. There's funding issues, there's all sorts of things surrounding that need to get dealt with. We need to have the conversation about what the GNWT's role is going to be in this territory in the future. And from there, we can start designing programs and start pushing programs out to the communities, or have the communities accept the programs. We need to be able to design services and programs for communities who are going to be receiving and delivering those. And that's based on what the government's role is going to be in the future. We don't know. Once the entire territory is settled and there's self-government agreements and they're being implemented, what's the role for the territory? We need to figure that out so we know how to proceed. And the other thing that I found came up almost as much as anything else was education. I wasn't surprised, because there's been a groundswell of support across the territory for reforming education, because people see that it's an unfair distribution of education in the territory. Yellowknife and Hay River, we both have excellent results. I spoke with a grad not that long ago, well, a while ago now, and there was students going to pre-med, there was physicists, we're graduating a lot of high-quality students in the regional centers and in Yellowknife, but the students in the communities aren't getting those same opportunities. And that's just not fair. There's nothing more basic than education, and I always say, we've had diamond mines for decades in the territory. Yellowknife has done well. So if we get more diamond mines, Yellowknife will continue to do well. But how does the rest of the territory benefit from that? And I think it's education. And I think people see that that's the way to go. So we need to reconsider how we deliver education in this territory. I know there are some initiatives that are happening, but I truly believe that the one thing that is similar between all very affluent and successful societies is education. And we need to make that a focus of not just this assembly, but of the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Because I always think, why don't people around the world look at the territory and say, we want to be like that? We talk about education in Norway. We talk about all of these things. We can be that. People can say, look what they've done. They had graduation rates of 60%, 40% in these communities, and they've turned that right around. And now they're the most well-educated, territory in Canada, or one in the world. So I went off a little tangent on there. I'm just passionate about education, and the people we spoke with yesterday were also passionate about education. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Martselos.
Having the dialogue since 2007 with the people around the table yesterday is for people to understand the day-to-day operations of people in the communities and the leaders and what they have to deal with very little. I hope that it was an education for everybody in this room to understand that we need stronger regional centers who have the monies to make sure that our communities are looked after. What happened in the last 8 years or so, the regional centers, they've been pulling our staff out of them, and so they're not serving not only the regional center, but the smaller communities. And, we have to realize that there's a bigger place than this place. And that was very clear yesterday. There was a lack of trust, and the trust has to be reinstated. We have the opportunity as a group around this table to give back that trust to the Indigenous people of the North. They're the majority, and we have to listen. I have great respect for every leader around that table, because as one of those leaders in the past, it is very, very difficult to move your mandate when you're dealing with child poverty, you're dealing with people who are having problems in the medical system, or you're having other problems and you don't know how to deal with it because your regional center has been broken down so that you can't deal with it. And if you make a call to the center, to Yellowknife here, the central office, it is very difficult. And there was also a sense that they want the claims settled. That was very, very clear. And they also want their agreements in place to be honored. There are many agreements in place, self-government agreements, and we're not honoring them. We had the Inuvik region, Dwayne Smith. He was very clear on some of the things that he said. And we have to listen and change the way we do things and build those relationships, because those are really precious relationships. They're special people. And I've sat with them since 2007, some changes in leadership, but it always comes down to the same thing. And we have an opportunity to make a difference. And we have to make that difference, not only on cabinet, but as a group. We're all building relationships, and that's the most important thing, is to build our relationship of trust with the Aboriginal people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are many things spoken around the table the other day, and so I'm going to talk about one that hit close to me in my heart. So Of course, we heard about trust and building relationships. We've been talking about that the whole day. But they kept saying this is a historical meeting. This government's been in operation for almost 50 years. I've heard that we've been trying to sell these negotiations for over 30 years. And this was a historical meeting? That's not okay. So that for me was a priority. I think that we need to take ownership and apologize and do better, because we can do better on that one. The other thing I heard is their offer willing to help to deal with the social issues. So again, I try to see, whenever I hear stories, I try to think how that would make me feel. And for 20 years ago, like I said, I went and got a degree in social work, and I made a conscious decision as a P1 candidate not to work for the GNWT, to work for nonprofit organizations, because I felt that nonprofits needed my support, that they do a lot of support, a lot better services, in all honesty, than sometimes the government can, because they're not stuck in those boxes that say you have to do this job description. So many years ago I left the Northwest Territories and I took a job for my own career in Salmon Arm and was administrating a family support center. A couple of years into that, I got a call from the Yellowknife Women's Society, our homeless shelter for women, some of our most vulnerable populations. And they said, we're going to close the door, Caroline. Please come back and help us. They were in debt $30,000 or $300,000. So I left my job in BC because my commitment is here. My heart was with those women. I'd worked many years with them. And I came back to the north. And I spent a couple of years, actually, and I brought them out of debt, and they're doing well now. But I had gone into the government for many years before I left here and said, please, you're trying to make us survive off of $30,000 core funding. We're housing women. We don't even have food. We're not paying our staff. We were picking choices and saying, who gets paid today? Who's got children and needs to get paid? We were feeding them hot dogs that were thrown out because we didn't have the food security programs in Yellowknife. People were bringing food, staff were bringing food from their own freezers to feed the women. So I tried a different tactic, and I went to the government and said, okay, I've been crying for 20 years, Arlene's been crying, everybody's been crying to help us, and you haven't heard us. How about if I help you? I don't want no money. Let's work together. And still the government said, thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much. We do that very well. We'll call you if we need you. And they never called us. I heard yesterday the word colonization. And you know what? That's exactly one of the priorities that I hear. Because if we're going in there and we're saying that we're going to work with Indigenous governments, but it's on our terms because we know better, then we're starting the relationship on the wrong foot to start with. We need to sit down at the table and say we're all equal here, because none of us is better. Self-government is not about us telling them what to do. It's about them defining their own future to be best for all of us. So we need to stop, and I'm sorry if I offend members, but sometimes we are very colonistic in our approach, and we need to stop doing that. We need to sit down at the table as equals, as equal governments, government to government, not one government over the other. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. And members, I direct your attention to the presence of former members in the gallery, Ms. Bizero, Mr. Moses, and Mr. Nakamayak. Welcome back to the chamber. Next, turn the floor over to Mr. O'Reilly.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I just want to take a moment to congratulate the 4 candidates that have put your name forward. Thank you very much for doing so. As we go on, it's getting harder to get new ideas and questions out, but the Auditor General of Canada concluded in October of 2017 that GNWT efforts on climate change had failed. We did make some progress in the last assembly, but I think we still have some way to go. So I'd like to ask each of the candidates, what specific policy, legislative, and/or structural changes would you propose to ensure that the NWT can meet international greenhouse gas reduction targets? So once again, policy, legislative, or structural changes. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. For this question, we'll start with Mr. Simpson, then Ms. Cochran, Mr. Lafferty, and Ms. Martselos. Mr. Simpson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a big question in the territory. When we talk about climate change, we often talk about adaptation because, as everyone knows, we're feeling the effects more than the rest of the world, essentially. So there definitely needs to be some strides taken to address that issue. We met with the Association of Communities, and the communities have been suffering greatly from this. I know Inuvik has been hit harder than anyone else in terms of the costs of keeping up with climate change. It's in the tens of millions of dollars. We need to utilize our expertise in certain areas right now, and unfortunately this is going to become our expertise, and this is an area in which we can build capacity, climate change mitigation and adaptation. It's tough in terms of reducing our greenhouse gases. I know that the carbon tax came in, and the whole point of the carbon tax was to reduce use by increasing costs. We're already at the point in the territory where our costs are so high that there's not much give. How much less are you going to drive? How much colder are you going to keep the house? So it's a difficult issue, but there are steps we can take, and I know the government has been taking some in terms of installing biomass heaters, but there are additional things we can do as well. There's interesting things happening with energy and heat production. I know that SSI Energy in Fort Providence has a project that they're getting off the ground to reduce emissions. There's the opportunity for converting diesel generators to biomass, which would there might not be a massive reduction in greenhouse gas. I'm not I don't have the numbers on me, but it would also create jobs as well. So we're in a tough position because we are feeling the effects so much more than the rest of the territory. But it doesn't mean that we get to stand by and claim that, well, since we're feeling the effects, we don't have to do anything. And it's a hard reality. It's, not a lot of people want to hear that, but it's the reality of life in the North. And so I look forward to the discussion next week in terms of our priorities to see what this Assembly wants to do going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, we shall go to Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Climate change is serious, and it's affecting not only us, but it's affecting the whole world. We often stand here and talk about that we're making changes for our children, for our grandchildren, for future generations, and yet we're not moving ahead as fast as we need to on climate change. So one thing I'd like to do is, I do think that, and I said that in my speech, we need to have a group, a working group, not just a token group, but a real group that maybe stays focused for the whole 4 years, that's comprised of cabinet members, regular MLAs, and Indigenous leaders. We need to look again at our 2030 NWT Climate Change Strategic Framework, because although it's a good document, I don't believe that it was done in proper consultation, and I think it could be a way stronger document. So I would like that working group to actually take that on. The big thing for me, it's not about legislation changes and policies and structural changes. We've talked about that. We need to look at green energy in our buildings and moving policies to incorporate when anything we do, our building, etc. The bigger thing is this is an international issue. This is not a territorial issue. So we need to be willing to put our name forward on behalf of the NWT, nationally and internationally. We have a duty to bring awareness to the whole world on what is happening. Some countries aren't being affected as much as us, but they will be. So we need to be internationally seated so that we can actually learn best practices across the world. Many countries do things better than us, and we're kind of hesitant to take them. We need to find out what's working and adapt them into ours, and we need to bring our own issues on a world basis and talking to them about what we're experiencing in the North, because people are not taking it seriously enough. If you don't see it, often you don't deal with it. So we need to bring this to their face, to their attention, internationally, and say this is affecting our whole world. So it's one thing to deal with a social program or make a legislation, make a policy, but this is our future. And this is something that we need to, from this day until the end of time, we need to take this seriously. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Lafferty.
Mr. Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, that climate change is such a huge impact. We're here in the Northwest Territories. We are experiencing and also experiencing rapid warming. And significant changes, obviously, in our wildlife, caribou, a prime example for our jurisdiction, and fire, and others. It does have an impact on the communities, infrastructures, health, and also the safety. We've heard yesterday from Mayor Paltak, Mr. Grubin, about his travels with family members, and they lost 2 machines. That's a real life, Mr. Chair. And we obviously need to do better with our own initiatives. We do have some strategies in place within GNWT. The Climate Change Framework 2030, 2030 Energy Strategy. Those are just some of the documents that we've created. And I'm a firm believer that we need to have our own northern solution, northern package that has the voice of the North, the people of the North, and so they can have their handprint on the actual legislation that goes through this House to deal with the climate change, the global warming, carbon pricing. So those are just some of the areas that we've been hearing from the federal perspective, federal coming down on us and said, this is what you're going to do. We stood against that. And I feel that we need to do more in those areas. We need to have our own, or crafting up our own legislation that meets the needs of the North. Let's reach out to the elders. Let's reach out to the communities. Those community harvesters are the experts. They deal with this day to day. Us sitting around the table, we don't. I'm a hunter myself, but I'm not as expert as those elders that are 80, 90 years old that can tell us stories similar to the one yesterday. And so we need to hear more of those stories and the sharing. Elders have always told us, share your stories and plant the seed within your legislative assembly. One of my elder, Pierre Beaverhole, prime example. They want us to move forward with their ideas and sharing their stories. So, Mr. Chair, there are a lot of areas that we can tackle these climate change and carbon pricing, but we do have some strategies in place. I believe we can expand on that as well. So, but it has to be a northern solution. Merci, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Martellus.
Well, I have a northern solution for climate change. I think that the climate change solution should be integrated into the Polytech University, and it should be situated in Inuvik because of the eroding shore, and the Arctic is there, and we should have a place of study so that all people of the world would want to come, Canada and all the people of the Northwest Territories, because I feel that it's such an important issue that we should have specialized people that would be teaching specialized courses on how to accommodate the issue of climate change. And that should be part of the Polytech University / University of the North.
Thank you, Ms. Martellus. And just a reminder to all members that please do ensure the red light is on before you start speaking, just to ensure that those people who are watching at home are able to hear. I will now go to, there are just a few members left who have yet to ask a question. So I will go to Ms. Chinna first. Ms. Chinna?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to comment on our meeting yesterday with the Indigenous groups. Yesterday, I was observant to hear all of the comments made around the table and the need for the government to start engaging with the Aboriginal groups, the settlement of land claims, and working with the self-government negotiations and trying to work together for them to finalize. I wanted to elaborate on the Sahtu region because I feel that there is a lot of success that has happened in that region. They are dealing with climate change. They have started to work and install their, what do you call those power panels? Solar panels, sorry. Yeah, the solar panels, and also working towards ensuring in the Gashagotin district is that they're installing wood stoves for each of the community membership, and also working towards and looking at the Bear River Bridge and the opportunities that come with it. I think that it's imperative that we start recognizing these successes within Indigenous groups and working with them, and not acknowledging them as clients, acknowledging them as partnerships. And with these success stories, I think that we should elaborate on them. And I think that going forward, that it's imperative that we meet with them regularly and on a consistent basis. I think that we could actually learn something from them through their successes and through their own initiatives, and working with the federal government and the money that they're actually accessing in becoming independent on their own. And I think going forward, my question is, how will the Premier ensure that the Indigenous and self-governments and local governments are supported and encouraged, and to be encouraged to work with them as partners and not clients?
Thank you, Ms. Chinna. The order for responding to this question will be Ms. Cochran, Ms. Martselos, Mr. Simpson, and Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran, floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm starting to feel a lot of the answers are kind of being restated all the time. It's about relationships, and it's about taking a different approach. It's about not thinking that we know the best solutions for everything, and the only way we'll build partnerships is if you listen to us or you agree to our terms. So taking down those walls is one of the big factors. The other thing I spoke about in my speech is actually meeting with Indigenous governments and community governments on a more regular basis, and building with Indigenous governments regional economic plans. If we actually work with our governments, all governments, and sit at the table and say, what would help you in your communities? Not saying we know, but what would help you in your communities? What would that look like? What do we both have to put on the table? I think that we would actually work better, and we'd get better services for our people. And that's what we're here for, is to provide better services for our people. So again, like I say, it's about being willing to meet more often. I like the idea, and I put it in my speech, about a regional economic plan so that every community is flourishing. Prosperity for all needs to be a slogan, a priority that we take within this government. And we need to pull up our socks and be willing to sit down and be willing to say that we are not the experts, we're not the bosses. We are all government to government on equal ground. And never forget that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Ms. Martselos.
I've been dealing with this file since 2007, and therefore I feel that my partnerships are built with all Indigenous governments and will continue to build. And I have an open door policy, and they all know that, and my door will always be open for any Indigenous government, any Indigenous leaders, and to ensure that their mandate and our mandate are looked at and mediated in the proper manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. I find that when a government has a mindset, that's from the top down. We could see it in some of the departments in last assembly, the sort of the personalities filter down through the departments, and I think that's the situation with the government of the Northwest Territories. There's an idea that the GNWT has the authority, will always have the authority, and that's why I've been talking about thinking about what the GNWT is going to be in the future and beginning that transition. In terms of working as partners, that's essential. I mean, we've heard it around the table so much yesterday where everyone said that we're better together. And we can access more federal money together as well. You know, if the Government of Canada sees us working in partnership as opposed to butting heads, as opposed to competing for money, you know, we'll have more success. And ultimately, that's money coming into the territory. We're all residents of the territory. And so the more money that comes in for our residents, the better. I also go back to something else that was said yesterday, is that we need to do a better job educating certain, the people who work with the Indigenous governments or with the small communities about the agreements and about the place of Indigenous governments in the territory. Because we are partners, but when you respond to an ad online, then you move up from Toronto, you might not realize that. You have a different mindset, so we need to do a better job educating our people about that as well. But basically, it comes down to a change in attitude. You know what? We need a change in attitude from the top down. It's going to filter down through the ranks so that we will exemplify that attitude of partnership and cooperation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Lafferty.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'd just like to say thank you to the Sahtu entrepreneurs, business people, and also community members for starting up solar panels, wood stove initiatives, and other initiatives that they talked about yesterday. We have to start appreciating that thinking outside the box, going out in their own initiatives. Those are pilot projects that we as JNWT always look for and explore. And I'd like to thank the member for her specific questions about partnership versus clientele. Clients, is basically a banking term, my clients. And I, for one, see community members as our family, partnership. We have to get away from this quit in yati. Quit in yati means these are terminology from outside our legislative assembly, outside the Northwest Territories. So we got to start using our own terminology. And that's creating partnership. We talked about that so many times, how we can work together and recognizing their success and other communities' success, that we should be appreciating that they've gone far enough that we should be stepping up to the plate with them. How can we assess? How can we be your partner? You've started something that will benefit the community, the region, the whole Northwest Territories. We should be open to those ideas. And yesterday I was kind of pleading like, well, we've been waiting on JNWT, federal government, but we're not getting anywhere, so we're going to go on our own. Good on them. That's excellent initiative. And we should be proactive. As a government, going forward, as a brand new government, let's be proactive and meet with those individuals. Meet with the successful business entrepreneurs in the community, small business owners. They have so many good ideas that we can generate our discussion around the table here, Mr. Chair. I just want to congratulate from the Sahtu region and other regions as well for coming out with their own ideas, their own initiative. Community Solutions is example of Northern Solution. Merci, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. I'll now turn to Ms. Summer for her question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have heard from our residents, the other candidates, our communities, that we need to find ways to support our residents who are struggling with addiction and homelessness. This is not a Yellowknife issue. It's not a regional center issue. It's in all our communities, just less visible. It has been asked to previous governments for treatment in the Northwest Territories, and it had always been told that this is not the best option. We also know that there's no support for those who do take the option to go outside and return home. How will you as a premier address this if it is a priority of this government in all of the NWT communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Semler. The order for response to this question will be Ms. Marcellos, Mr. Lafferty, Ms. Cochran, and Mr. Simpson. So I'll turn the floor over to Ms. Marcellos.
As you know, every family deals with this issue. No matter what color, age, gender, whatever, everybody has a problem within a family. There's no boundaries for addiction issues. What I did in my community was we did on the land with and had PAL makers come in and do the program for 6 weeks. We did that 3 times. Plus, we also brought them in for aftercare. But I firmly believe that a full-service addiction center is required for the Northwest Territories. What I mean by full service is that you have the proper staff. Staff that are trained to deal with all the different traumas that happen within families and within people's lives that have made this happen to our people. You can still do the on the land programs within the communities, but there are some cases that are past that sometimes and have mental issues. There's mental issues involved. And I think that we need a territorial addiction center in the Northwest Territories also. And it was a very successful program, the Fort Smith On the Land program. We had the whole team, including a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and a full team from PAL makers that came to Fort Smith and did the 6-week program. Everybody was entitled to that in the Northwest Territories with the way the funds were done from the Department of Social Services and the Health Department here. Not everybody took advantage of it because I don't know how people felt about it, but I know that the programs that we did with Salt River, and it was open to all the community. We did not say it was only for Salt River. And we had members from all the community that came to the On the Land program. And so, I know that we need an addiction center in the Northwest Territories, and I mean a full-service one, where testing is involved, because not all addiction centers have that. I know that aftercare is extremely important. I know that we have many problems with this in all the communities. I know there's a problem here in Yellowknife. You walk down this main street, and there are problems. And, so it's a big issue, and it has to be looked at by everyone around this table to correct the situation, to try and deal with the issue, to feel for the people that are suffering from addiction and from mental health issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martzellos. Next, I will go to Mr. Lafferty.
Merci.
Thank you. This issue is a big one. When we talk about addictions for the Northwest Territories, maybe we have this issue in all the 33 communities. They are our relatives. How can we help them? Sometimes Even though they talk to us about their issues, we don't know how to help them. There's a lot of issues and concerns about treatment center. We did have treatment centers at one time and they closed. We also talk about aftercare program and we don't have enough of that. Once people come back from treatment, they don't know how to be helped, even though they were in treatment for a whole month and they returned back to their communities, and the pressure of friends and family are really strong and they go back to their old ways. We need to have an aftercare program for them, programs for them in the community. I think we need to have everything in place for them once they return from their treatment. When I made my speech, my premier speech, I mentioned about working with the elders and on the land. Bringing the youth out on the land is an important one. When we also look at homelessness, people that don't have any housing, and some of them have addictions. If we work with the elders, if we take them on the land, they are the most skilled people that you can think of when you take them out on the land. And they are the happiest when they are out on the land. They are respected on the land because they know the skills. But once they return from the south, they don't have an aftercare program. I think we need to review this whole issue of addictions and how we can help our people, especially the idea of on the land program. And a lot of young people are sleeping on the streets. Let's pick them up. Some of these people are the most skilled on the land. Myself, I have a lot of people that live on the street myself. 15 years ago, we never heard of anyone being homeless. But now, today, a lot of the issues, we can see that it's visible in the community. I want to bring my people back home because they are the most skilled on the land. Because of their addiction, either drugs or alcohol, it's stronger, and they have no housing as well. But as a government, I think we need to take a look at this. With the elders' advice, we can create an on-the-land program to help our people, even in the Satu region. They have a justice program that is working. We tried, it's a pilot project. It was running very well at one time. And when the government changed, that program changed as well. But we can review that program again. And I'd like to thank the MLA from Maneuver for posting that question. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran.
Ms. Cochran?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This one's dear to my heart, and so I'm going to take a different turn than the other speakers have taken. So I'd like to be able to say that addictions and homelessness, we can get a treatment center. We'll get a treatment center in every single community. You know I can't do that. We'll get a house for every person. Nobody will be homeless. Can't do that either right now. But the key is that those aren't the answers. It's not addictions. People don't just drink because they like the taste of alcohol. People don't just end up homeless because they have nowhere to stay. They have families, they have other people. We're talking about mental health. We're talking about self-esteem. My mother started drinking when I was 7 years old. She never touched a drop before that. She had 8 kids and an abusive husband, and there weren't the supports. So I remember sitting down at the table when I was a young child, to this day, and she picked up a bottle of vodka, and she said, if you can't beat them, join them. And my mother never sobered up until all of us children left home. And she lost a kidney before she actually sobered up. It took almost losing her life. So the answer isn't just getting addiction treatment centers, although we need them. We definitely need them. The answer isn't just getting houses, although we need them. We definitely need them. The answer is early intervention and dealing with people's wellness, their pride in themselves. If we can get more people some early intervention, early childhood development, parenting support, family supports, pride and culture, taking them out when they're young, taking them on the land. Those things all help. When I was working at the Yellowknife Women's Centre, and like I said, over 20 years and 15 years administrating nonprofit organizations, the women that I deal with, in fairness, I never dealt with men, I dealt with women. But the women weren't saying I drank when I was 20 because I liked the thing. I'm homeless because nobody will house me. The women were telling me I'd been molested since I was 3 years old. Nobody loved me since I was a baby. I was in child protection and thrown out on the street when I was 16 years old. Those are the issues that we're dealing with within that population. So we can skirt around the issue and we can say that we're going to get treatment centers in the territories, which we need. We're going to put people in houses, which we need. But until we deal with people's self-esteem, until their mental wellness, we will always be putting Band-Aids on this. So pride in ourselves, family supports, early intervention, in my belief, is the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to say I agree with much of what Ms. Cochran said. You know, we all know people who you would like to get help for, but they're not in a position where they want to go get help. You know, it's such a difficult situation when you look at it, when you know those kind of people, when you walk downtown. So what do? Is it the aftercare? Is it the treatment? No, I agree that it is. It's mental health, but how do we provide that? You know, how do we get there early enough? This is one of those issues that is so broad that cuts across so many government departments that needs the participation of the Indigenous governments in the community governments, families, everyone involved. So if this is something that this Assembly wants to tackle, I'd like to see us do it wholeheartedly. You know, I know there are mental health and addiction strategies, but are those effective? Have we seen a decrease? You know, we still have the worst rates in the country, basically. You know, but probably some of the worst rates in the developed world. So we can't do this by half measures. If we want to go in, we have to go all in. And that's why next week is going to be tough. You know, we want infrastructure projects, but we want to help people as well. You know, mental health, there's a lot of communities, that's a lot of mental health workers. There's a lot of communities, there's a lot of aftercare. There's a lot of housing that we need. And I commend Salt River on partnering with Pound Makers. I think they have a great program, and maybe that's something we need to do more of, is going to the people who know how to provide treatment and partnering with them, because the GNWT, more and more I wonder whether or not we need to rely on their expertise. Sometimes we need to go outside and partner with people who are actually doing this work. And so it's a big question. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's going to take a big commitment. And do I have a plan? No. Does anyone here really have a plan? No. It's going to take more than just us in the room to come up with a plan and really address this. But just take a walk down the street and you'll see why it needs to be done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. And for, I believe, the final question of this round, we'll turn to Mr. Bonrush.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon to my colleagues. I would like to thank the candidates for putting your name forward for Premier. All the best to each of you. I actually had it for this morning, but my question is related, I guess, into the mental health, self-esteem type of an issue. It's basically regarding the workforce, the Make Work programs. The people of the North need work. Optimism is about giving hope to the people for a better future. I'm talking about the immediate future, like tomorrow. For the people of the North, work equals much-needed income. Providing work develops happy people, happy families, and most of all, improves a person's self-esteem, which I believe is much needed. Providing work equates to stimulating local economies. This is a win-win situation. In the past, funds have been secured from the federal government to create the much-needed work programs for all the communities of the Northwest Territories. It has been done. With that in mind, I ask the question of all the premier candidates, what is your strategy to securing that type of funding to stimulate the economy of the communities of the North? Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Bonnet Rouge. For this round, we'll begin with Mr. Lafferty, then Ms. Cochran, Mr. Simpson, and Ms. Martzellos. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair,
Those of us in the smaller communities, I totally agree with what he is saying. It's very difficult to find jobs and employment. And it's because of that that puts people in situation. We also talk about mental health and self-esteem. When people don't have a job, it interferes with the way they're thinking. They created these programs in the communities before, and money was flowing to the communities at that time. Maybe it's something, that kind of program, we should take a look at again. Those of us in the smaller communities.
Federal government I use law, Kimi government municipality city de Hataka de Hoti de Dihin. Tani wants a daddy lesson. It's not working?
I got it. Because it's off. As I said just a little while ago, on the community employment, if we all work together and how we're going to make more employment for the communities. In our community, we have community friendship centers. We have to work with them in our community. Small community employments in the north are the ones that are helping the communities to make them thrive again. There's also the security, people like that working at nights. We have to work more for them, try for them. I know that Northwest Territories government and Aboriginal government have to work with each other in order to, I know that a lot of them are have that issue in their communities. I know that there's a lot of grade 12 graduate, even though they're they're graduated, they're still on the street. How can we help those kind of young people? What type of work are they looking for? We have to think ahead for them. We have to tell them, try this or try this. If we don't try anything different, it's always going to be the same. So I think we should all work together, sit and work together to help resolve this issue. Where is the problem? Where is it that we need to help them with funding? What is the gender of people that are have this problem? So small community employment is very important to the small communities in order to help themselves with this issue. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's a number of things I think that we should be doing. As I spoke a few times now and in my speech, I talked about developing regional economic plans with our Indigenous governments so that every region has some industry, some infrastructure happening, and that we're conscious that we're spreading out the wealth amongst all of us. A few things I haven't talked about and I'm going to bring forward now is apprenticeships. It's been a year and a half ago, maybe almost 2 years ago, I was the housing minister. I've had some portfolios, I kind of forget the timeline, but I was housing minister for 2 years. And my focus was really on getting people the skills so that they could maintain the houses versus pay your rent and get out. But one thing I heard in the back and I never got time to address because foolishly I thought I would keep that portfolio for 4 years, and I realized that that's not how politics works sometimes. We only had, I believe it was 15 apprenticeships in the whole housing. 33 communities and 15 apprenticeships? That's not okay. So we as a government, if we're going to take seriously about giving work skills, then we need to actually bump that up and bring in more apprenticeship programs into our own, into the GNWT, and before we go outside. The other thing I'll talk about is income support. So I know that income support, like I said, we have productive choices now, and I've talked in my speech about a guaranteed income. So people that are on long-term income support, instead of penalizing them, we'll give them a guaranteed income, and then they can actually have more incentive to actually get to look for other work, and they won't get penalized dollar for dollar from their money. But the other thing that we need to look at is our productive choices. So I heard with an income support that if people have diagnoses like mental health illnesses, then they don't have to do a productive choice. And I'm okay with that. But I'll share another story because Indigenous people are storytellers. So I have an aunt, I don't have an aunt anymore, she's passed, my Aunt Miriam. I don't know what her problem was. When I was young, Aunt Miriam was older than me and she'd already had a mental illness, and so I don't know what it is, I can't stand here and say. But she stayed on the farm with my grandma for years until my grandma passed away, and then she went into a home down in Alberta. And I worried about her because she was a farm girl. So I went to see her, and Aunt Marion was in this facility. And in that facility, they had a little greenhouse. And every day, my aunt went down and watered the plants. That was her whole job, just watering plants. My Aunt Marion lived until, I think she passed away about 10, 15 years ago. She lived into old age, and she loved her job. She loved the work that she did. So I'm not saying that we need to force people. I'm saying we need to open up our productive choices and make it open so that people can make choices based on what their wishes are. The other thing that I want to talk about is our small employment fund. So I believe it was $8 million, I think we had gotten into the last assembly for that. And again, we had a small community committee that oversaw that, and I was the minister responsible for that funding. However, I started towards the end talking to the governments, the community governments, the Indigenous governments, because what I seen was that they had $8 million and they were hiring people for drive that gravel truck into the community. So they were spreading out the money. They, cut those logs and bring it to the elders. People were getting jobs, but they weren't sustainable. And that's not okay. So towards the end of it, I started to talk to the governments, to the people that were accessing that and saying, what about moving this into sustainable income? So instead of just hiring that one person to haul your gravel from the gravel pit to the community for one time and that person gets money, what about looking at ways you can actually start your own gravel pit, that you can actually start a business on it? Instead of cutting wood for one elder and getting paid for that, what about starting it as a business and being able to sell it to other people? So I think we need to think out of the box again with the programs that we have. I said that earlier. We're going to have to make hard decisions. We have to make sure that our programs are meeting the intent. So I don't think the answer is just throwing out free money and saying, here it is, because we will always have building dependency. Our goal should not be about building dependency. It should be about making people, and I don't believe in interdependent either, because that's my father's side. That's more of a Caucasian side with the white picket fence. My mother's side would say interdependent. So we need to rely on each other and support each other, but we need to make these employment programs sustainable in the long term. And I think that's the key, and we need to look at our productive choices, and we need to look in the government and see what we're doing to build the skills and the training. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you for the question. And there's been a lot of talk today about how do we build economies in small communities and in the regions. And I hope that this next assembly joins me in focusing on regional empowerment. I think we need to think about how to devolve not just government jobs to regions, but also devolve not just jobs, but authority to regions and communities. Because once people in the regions can start making decisions, they can start making decisions that actually work for them and that aren't just handed down. And some of those decisions might be about who gets funding to start a new business or things like that, or who gets funding to go to Northern Farm Training Institute for training. Don't find a reason to put jobs in Yellowknife. Find a reason to put jobs in the communities and in the regions. It's easy to find reasons why not to do that. We need to task ourselves with finding reasons to do that. And we need to support people in the regions who want to do things for themselves. We heard some success stories from the Sahtu, and I know of success stories in other small communities. And the government, when they see that, we need to support that. The government doesn't have to do everything. If someone's doing something for themselves, support that. And I think that we have to consider the fact that we may need to reconsider or reimagine what economies are in small communities. There's some small communities that their economy was the fur trade. Well, the fur trade isn't the way it used to be. So what do we do for that community? We're not going to shut it down and move it. Those days are long gone. So what do? Is it better to have people unemployed because there's costs associated with that? Or is it better to maybe subsidize a small industry where people are working, they're getting up and they're going to work, and which means when they get up, they're taking the kids to school. If they weren't getting up for work, maybe their kids weren't going to school. So I think we need to start having those conversations because the status quo isn't working. I think we need some bold ideas, some ideas that might make us uncomfortable, but we have to try. And I think the question was how are we going to get the funds, the access to federal funds? Again, partnerships. We need to build better partnerships with Indigenous governments and go together to Ottawa. Because I think that's how you do it. And I've seen success stories around the territory when it's done that way. So again, it comes down to partnerships. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Martzellos.
I think it's an excellent question because I think that immediate action has to happen because from what I'm hearing from the member is that make work programs are necessary for employment, not studied for another 2 years, but now. And I think we have to be creative in our thinking at our level to ensure that we accommodate those smaller communities and the regions to be able to actually do what we say we want to do to spread the wealth to the smaller communities and the regions to make sure that people have the choice of wanting to be able to be employed, whether it be in a Fire Smart program, whether it be planting trees, whether it be to cutting wood. These are part of the green program, and you can get funds from that from the federal government to access it, but there's also the whole idea of the ITI programs that are under our departments. They have to be shared equally. I find that many times that you have ministers or people in those departments that kind of dictate where the money is going to go. I think we have to look at those very carefully and to ensure that everybody has a fair share. I strongly believe that the smaller communities should have a say, and especially the Indigenous governments. They are the ones that are that's where they usually knock on the door when there's no employment, when people don't have any food on the table, and they're in a crisis situation. Make work programs are very important to the small communities. On the larger scale, the regions have to be able to have the staff to be able to do that, to answer the call for help to the smaller communities. And lots of times in the past couple of, at least 8 years now, that has not been happening. Because what's happened is that the strong central government has taken over and have left us in a bind where we cannot serve the communities. They've taken most of our senior staff away and left everybody kind of hanging. We cannot do that. We have to build those partnerships again. We have to ensure that we're serving all the Northwest Territories equally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. That completes the first round. As members have agreed, members may ask a second question of the candidates for Premier. Before we begin the second round of questions for the candidates for Premier, we'll take a short break, and I'd ask members to be back in the chamber in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Welcome back, members. It's been a full day. I know some of you have flights to catch this afternoon. If I could just get a sense from members who has a second question that they plan to ask. If you could just raise your hand. Okay, I think we should be able to accomplish that. However, I would ask both the members who are asking questions and those who are responding to try and keep your questions as succinct as possible, as well as your answers as succinct as possible. I'm going to rearrange the clock on the answers to about 2.5 minutes. Again, I won't be cutting anyone off after the 2.5 minutes is up, but just a bit of a reminder to try and speed things along. So, a second question. Ms. Green.
Thank you. My constituency has a large population of intoxicated and/or homeless population, and they are from all over the NWT. They're not only from Yellowknife. This was a huge issue during my campaign. There are a number of people who don't feel safe downtown because of the concentration of numbers. GNWT and the city have worked together to provide services, but they don't seem adequate to the issue that they're trying to address there. So there has been an evaluation of the centre. It provides a bit of a blueprint for changes going forward. But my basic question is, what is the GNWT's responsibility for resolving outstanding issues downtown? So what role should the GNWT be taking in that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. We'll go Mr. Simpson, Ms. Marcellos, Ms. Cochran, and Mr. Lafferty. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not quite familiar with the file as it is. Like, I do stay downtown there, and so I'm very familiar with the situation. But I'm not sure what the outstanding issues are and where the GNWT needs to step in. But this is an issue in a lot of places. In Hay River, we had the high-rise closed down, which means we now have people living on the street, a number of people that never used to before, and they are out and about, and there's sort of similar concerns as well. So, there's a role to be played. I honestly, I don't know enough about the specifics of this issue, but it's a public safety issue, so we should probably be looking at partnerships as well with the city of Yellowknife. But I'd be happy to speak with the member and address this, help address this, no matter what my role is. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Marcellos.
We have to realize that these people that are on the street are members and people of the Northwest Territories. So, saying that I think there has to be a bit of more feelings in how we deal with this issue, because it is a very important issue when you have people on the street, and yes, they may be mostly from all other communities, but I'm sure there are people on the street from Yellowknife also, right? Yes. So we have to be more sensitive to the issue. I think that there has to be a solution, and we have to, as a government, look at the issue with the member that brought it up and try to find solutions. Some of these people have never gone back home for maybe many years. Maybe encouraging them and helping them to make that journey home and to reconnect with family might be one of the solutions. I think that we have to look at it in a holistic approach to see what is best for not only the person on the street, but what is best for the community. Okay, so I would ensure that we address the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marcellos. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I definitely think the GNWT has a role to play with addressing our intoxication downtown and the homelessness that we're experiencing. However, I want to be clear and say that not everyone that you see downtown is homeless. That's a misperception. I personally have friends that I've known all my life that actually work for my brother, and when they come into town after diamond drilling, they're downtown intoxicated. So it's not only homelessness we're dealing with. Intoxication is not okay. I grew up in this community. In 1960s, when I was a young child, I could walk on the street. There was no pavement and no sidewalks. I want to tell people how far we've come in the last while. But there weren't the amount of homeless people out there, and people weren't afraid to walk. We left our doors open. We stopped when vehicles were in trouble. We were very community-minded. Yellowknife's changed. Yellowknife is mostly being people from the south now. There's very few Yellowknifers here. We've lost some of that community spirit, and hopefully we can work to gain that back. But so with the public intoxication, that's not okay. That's a safety issue. And children and parents and women, men should not be afraid to walk in our streets. So we have a role. We work with the federal government on the RCMP, and we need to bump up that services so that the RCMP are actually doing street patrols like they did many years ago. The other thing too is if we're only building shelters, I've said that many times in Yellowknife, build it and they will come. These people, I would say, my guesstimate from 20 years working with homeless women, probably over 90% of them are actually from the smaller communities. And people love their children. It's not that people want their children to just disappear. If a person's stuck in addictions or mental health and you don't have the support, at what point does a parent say that my family isn't safe anymore, I need to take care of my other children? And it's a hard choice for a parent to close the door and say my child has to leave because my other children are not safe. But the other thing is when those people are ready to get to heal and stop their addictions, the best support they can have is their family and community to support them. Because I've seen women in the shelter that fall off. They say, I want to clean up, and then their friends say, have another drink. So when I was the housing minister, I actually focused on building shelters outside of the community. Minister Alfred Moses concluded them. So we had 3 homeless shelters, one in Betchco, Fort McPherson, and Clavic. And I think that's part of the answer, with wraparound supports. So if we only build in Yellowknife, we're missing the boat. We need to build in all communities so that people have a chance when they're ready to heal, that the wellness, the supports are there for them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci. Mr. Chair, this is a particular area that it is a high need for this government to deal with. The city and also JNWT have been working together on this particular file through anti-poverty strategy over the years. And I've recently met with the Mayor Elty to deal with or share some of my concerns as my constituents are part of the homelessness in Yellowknife. How can we deal with those matters? And she's willing to assess and help and want to be a partner with JNWT. So let's open those doors. Not only that, but there's been transition homes and safe homes as well. Just down the street from us, there's a hotel being converted into a home. But apparently the money kind of dried up, so it's kind of on hold, I believe, from my understanding. Those are areas that we need to look at, reevaluate what truly happened there. And it was going forward, and then all of a sudden, it's becoming a money issue. Friendship Center is another one that a lot of our communities have them. And I think one of the areas that we can tackle is program delivery through the Friendship Centers to deal with homelessness. Like I stated earlier, bring my constituents back to my constituent, my bishop home. I can only speak to that at this point. But with addiction, like every community, we have challenges. But we have programs in the community. If we can expand our programs, I think that's where we can commit as a JNWT, to expand more into program delivery into the communities. And yeah, Mr. Chair, just meeting with Aboriginal leadership yesterday. Again, they raised a lot of issues pertaining to addiction and homelessness. So we need to tackle this at the forefront. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Next question, Ms. Cleveland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had the opportunity over the last week to visit with mayors of different communities all the way from the Arctic Ocean down to the border of Alberta and Fort Smith. Community government funding not only pays for water and sewage, but it also funds programs and services that create vibrant, active, inclusive communities. How do you as Premier plan to address the community funding gaps? And do you feel that we are costing the GNWT more money long-term by not closing that gap and empowering our community governments? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. First up, we have Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Community government funding gap. So I believe it was the Assembly before the last one, so probably the 17th Assembly, when they did the research, when they did the analysis, and they found out the 3 categories. And every year we've been trying to address it. So I know it's pronounced at $40 million. We have addressed, in my belief, around 10 million of that, so I think we're sitting about 30 million. The major deficit at this point is in capital. So we're pretty close to the other areas that need to be funded. It's the capital. So we've been working diligently. Municipal and Community Affairs has been working with the community governments to try to get capital funding for their communities, successfully actually doing that work. It's been actually pretty good. The community governments do have a gap, $30 million approximately. The GNWT has a gap, $101 billion. So in my opinion, it would be unattainable to say that we're going to, in 1 year, or even in the term of this Assembly, to address that deficit and start giving $30 million extra a year. For one, it hasn't been addressed. We haven't set our priorities. If that is one of the priorities, then we should be looking at it. But I have a feeling we're going to have many priorities based on the conversations that we've had here. So we have to be working within that. So instead of saying that we're going to deal with that in 4 years, what I would like to say is that we have to deal with it on an annual basis. It has to be part of the equation, and every year we have to be willing to work towards it. At some point, and I know people might not like to hear this, bureaucrats, we're going to have to redo that study, because if the capital funding is one of the areas, for example, water treatment centers or community arenas, etc., and we've got water treatment plants now in every single community in the Northwest Territories. Is that still on the books? Those are questions that I have. So it might not be a popular thing within the government, but I think at some point we're going to have to redo that study and see where we stand. So I think we all have to work at working together to bring the resources, the financial assets for all of us, the GNWT, the community governments, and the Indigenous governments. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Next up, we will have Mr. Lafferty, and then we will have Ms. Martzelos and Mr. Simpson. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this is a question so
when I was campaigning, I sat with the mayor of Yellowknife, and she has also expressed her concern, and also all the mayors of Northwest Territories. They also spoke with us about this issue, about the community funding gap. Why is it there's a gap? That's why we are here asking questions about it. That was in the past, when you look at how they're concerned about it. Why are they concerned about the gap? Wellness to be saved in a small community, and there's not enough fundings. They can't live properly in a community, especially with water. The capital funding, if it's less capital funding, it's no good. We have to reevaluate and look at it. How can we do something different? I think we should revisit that. Why is it there's less funding for that? I know that the mayor, we can always meet with the mayor, and we can also express our concern. I know that we can't always fix everything, but we can fix some things to help the people. It seems that we're doing a little bit here and there. We can't seem to get ahead. I think I think we should get together, try to resolve this issue, and move ahead. So capital funding, we need capital funding if we are to do any big project. That's what I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Communities are extremely important, and I think that we have to have a dialogue with the communities, especially the funding if there's a shortfall. And obviously there is, because the report that I looked at last night showed that there are shortfalls. I think that we have to, like other people have answered, that we have to evaluate it and set priorities. And part of those priorities have to be done around this table. And but I think that it's really important that we keep the channels of dialogue and an open mind, and listen to some of the concerns of the community governments, because some of those community governments don't have a lot of things that a lot of other places have, and we have to be open to ensure that, like I said at the beginning, that the wealth has got to be shared. And I feel very strongly about strong communities, strong regional centers, and ensuring that the wealth is shared. Thank you so much.
Ms. Martellus. Next up, we have Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. This is a concern of mine, and and I've already stated this in my first speech in this House, this Assembly, that this community government infrastructure funding gap needs to be addressed in a significant way during the life of this Assembly. The question was asked, is it costing the GNWT money? Well, it is in Hay River. In Hay River, we need to expand. We need to put roads in, put sewer lines in, put water lines in so that we can start developing houses so people can move to town, which they want to do. We don't have enough houses for people to live right now. And every person we bring in is going to be $35,000 GNWT. 200 people, that's $6.5 million a year in transfer payments that the GNWT isn't getting because the community can't afford to put in this additional infrastructure. And this money isn't even for the infrastructure, this is for replacement infrastructure. So, Ms. Cochran said that when she was growing up in Yellowknife, they had gravel roads. I live in Old Town in Hay River. We still have gravel roads. We're never going to get paved roads at this rate. This is the case of the GNWT prioritizing its infrastructure needs over community infrastructure needs. Maybe we don't address the gap in its entirety, but maybe the GNWT pulls back and says, okay, communities, we recognize your value and your worth and the fact that you need this money in order to grow and grow the economy and lower the cost of living, and so we're going to support you. Because, if we can get this money in Hay River and we can get this new expansion, there's going to be places to live, which means the cost of rent is going to go down. People are going to be able to afford, not just heat, but heat and power. Afford some groceries. This is a big issue and it needs to get dealt with. So I want to thank the member for bringing it up, and it's going to be one of my priorities going forward. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. Next question, we have Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Once elected as Premier, will you lobby to ensure the Mackenzie Valley Highway connects all the way down the valley from Inuvik to Wrigley? Because one of these days I'd like to be able to drive from Sigachik to Yellowknife and without having to go through the Yukon and BC. So within my lifetime I'd like to see this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Mr. Blake. The order of responses, we will have Ms. Martellus, Mr. Simpson, Mr. Lafferty, and Ms. Cochran. Ms. Martellus.
I'm in favor of all highways and roads. I think that highways and roads build prosperity and economic growth. I'm not only in favor of the Mackenzie Valley, the Mackenzie Highway, but I'm also in favor of the the road through the park, the Garden River Road, so that we have access also in Fort Smith for the Fire Smart program. There's no other way out if anything ever happened there. And we have a lot of trees and a lot of things that happen there that could, if we ever had to evacuate that community, we don't have anywhere else to go. So all roads, and especially the Mackenzie Valley Road, the highway, is extremely important to the Northwest Territories. It's an infrastructure. Any roads anywhere is vital infrastructure for not only for connections, but for families to connect, for businesses to thrive, and for people to be able to come in to visit us as tourists. Thank you so much.
Merci, Ms. Martelos. Next, we have Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. The role of the Premier is to sorry, 1 second. It's been a long day, I'm a little sleepy. The Premier's job is to lobby the federal government. The Premier's job is to build relationships with other governments, but it is not the Premier's prerogative to set the priorities of the government. So unfortunately, if this Assembly doesn't choose the Mackenzie Valley Highway as its priority, I don't think that it would be appropriate for the Premier to go and lobby Ottawa. That being said, I think that the Mackenzie Valley Highway is probably the best investment that this territory could make. You see what's going on in Tuck with the tourism. Imagine if instead of going up and down the Dempster, they come through the territory. Imagine the economic growth that would bring to the communities, thousands and thousands of tourists. Imagine the lowering of the cost of living. I think that it is the sort of grand project that we need in order to really fulfill the promise of the territory. And so I hope that if I am Premier, I have the ability to lobby for it, because it would be one of the priorities of the Assembly. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. Members, our interpreters have asked that you take short pauses during your questions and responses to give them a chance to keep up. Thanks. Next, we have Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the Mackenzie Valley Highway.
Regarding the Mackenzie Highway, as MLAs, once we create our mandate, and this is included, we will approach the federal government for funding. They already have this mandate to expand the road, just the same as our Hoti all-weather road. We've been advocating for this for many years, and now it's in place. Now we see a lot of our young people employed by this road. We know what kind of prosperity it could bring to the community, and this kind of jobs are expanding. The MLAs, once we all agree that this will be one of our mandate, we will push for this issue. Once we start pushing this issue, it may become a reality one day if we all support each other. Sometimes pushing this kind of issues is very difficult, and some of us are here only for 4 years. Once we put this as one of the mandate, and sometimes the executive and premier changes, but once they are in place, I'm sure that we could put this as a priority. And we all know that once an all-weather road is in place, a lot of the expenses will go down, and there will be employment for our young people. So I think it's very important that we push this. Just like we talked about yesterday, I'm sure they all think the same. As all of us, all the 19 of us, we can all push this. So once the Premier is in place, he will push the federal government. That's part of the Premier's job. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. once the Premier is in place, she can push things. So I agree that highways are important. The Mackenzie Valley Highway is actually one of the examples I gave in my speech. The Mackenzie Valley Highway, the Tolson and the Slave Geological Road, I think are major infrastructure projects. But I also said today that hold us to account by what we promise you. And in my speech, I actually promised that I would be doing regional economic development plans with Indigenous governments. So I do know that MLAs, that we have a right to, and we do, we make our own priorities. But I've also stated today that we've got to stop our colonistic kind of ideal and saying that we know best, we are the answer, because we've been talking over and over about building that relationship. So if we come in with the perception and say, this is our priority or this is not our priority, we're backstepping. So we will make our priorities in this assembly, that may be one of them, but my commitment is that I will meet, as if I am elected as your Premier, then I will meet with the Indigenous governments and work with them to make regional economic development strategies, and then based on that, work with them to lobby the federal government to actually pay for that. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Ms. Cochran. Next question, we have Mr. Jacobson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I hope everybody wants to talk about shoreline erosion and climate change. My home community of Tuktoyaktuk, we live it. I have 4 houses in our community that have had to move fuel tanks because a fuel tank was 20 inches away from falling into the ocean and the other one was 18. As a Hamlet of Tuk, sitting on the Hamlet of Tuk for the last 3.5 years, and we've been working with our government and at no success. We got funding 2 years ago from from the federal government, $872,000. And we've been waiting for meetings to come and work with the community to get these houses moved. Nothing yet. On my campaign that I did, I went to every one of those 4 houses that are affected, and I told them we're not going to move now. Federal government came and gave us funds to try to do it. No help, nothing. So now what we're going to do as this government and you guys, the premiers, I'm going to hold whoever's accountable as the Premier of the Northwest Territories to fix my problem for my people that are affected. And these are 3 of them are elders. Why should we move? We're not going to move. You guys are going to come and you're going to lobby with me down in Ottawa to get the funds to do this. You know, we have to get, it's the little things like that need to be started in the communities. Our government downloading to the hamlets in the communities, it's got to stop. It's like they said, $30 million shortfall. Can't bring it up, but we'll work together. Everybody's got to work together to try to get this done. And it's not only Tuk, we got 6 other communities up and down the Mackenzie River that need help. So I want to see what can we do to work together to get it done for these people in my home community to stay where they're at and not being able to move. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobson. First we have Mr. Lafferty, Mr. Simpson, Ms. Martzellos, and Ms. Cochran. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Madam Chair. The shoreline erosion, in my view, it's a safety issue, health issue that we definitely need to deal with as a government. And federal government, 872,000 that the members alluding to, but there hasn't been anything happening there. You got to question why there's a stall there. And the hamlet of Tuk, to my understanding, is that they've been working on a plan for some time now. And to put some sort of a barrier wall, and but there's other options that they're dealing with. We need to hear them out. We need to work with them, and also to hear their perspective, because they will be the experts dealing with those areas of challenges that they're faced with. we as a territorial government need to meet with the committee of TUC and hear their plan. Federal government, well, if we wait, I'm not sure how long we're going to wait for them, but if it's becoming a real issue for four community households, in my view, it's a part of emergency issues that we need to deal with. And so if I was elected premier, I would focus on the attention to say, okay, what can we do? Is there any way that we can, what has the community done? The federal government contribution, where is it at? And GWT, what have we been doing? Can we move forward on this file instead of the four houses coming down? And we need to prevent that from happening. And I'm not in a position to say we should move the community or community members. That should be the last resort. But it's a safety of the community members and the household. So we need to deal with it immediately. Merci.
Merci, Mr. Lafferty. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. And I don't know much about this issue, but I do know a little bit. I know that people in Hay River, their family has been affected, and it's one of those four homes, and so I've heard a bit about it. And this sounds like there's a lot of moving parts. I know there's the Hamlet's involved, the Government of Canada is involved, the GNWT is involved, but most of all, these four families are involved. And this sounds like a constituent issue. And if there's one thing that I believe as an MLA, it's that we have to take care of our constituents. And you know, I've always behaved myself as an MLA the way that I would want my MLA to behave. And so if someone comes to me with this issue, it's one that I would help them pursue to the best of my abilities, because there's a small group of people who are being adversely affected by something that's far beyond their control. And these are the kind of times when the government needs to step up, and if that's not happening, then that's the time when you go to your minister, you go to the premier, and you make some things happen. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Martellos.
The members' concerns is very important, because you have four houses in an emergency situation, and it's an issue. It's a major issue. It affects the families. It affects the lives. I mean, I don't know how they even sleep at night. You know, and I think we are in a position to have a look at all the possibilities and to bring you a solution. And if I become premier, I will make sure that the solution is favorable, and it is the right thing to do. And but you'll have to look at the whole shoreline, and you have to make sure that it's safe for the people there. But there has to be a solution that is favorable to all parties. Thank you.
Merci, Ms. Martellos. Ms. Cochrane.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's actually quite disheartening to hear that people in those homes have actually been told not to leave, to stay there, and we'll find a solution, because I have seen the pictures. And some of those homes, like, they only have another few feet before they're falling off a cliff into the ocean. So it is an emergency situation. I do know that when I was Municipal and Community Affairs, we were working on it. I know that Alfred Moses carried forward that work and tried to get money for it. I have no idea why the federal government never brought it forward. I think that we could be lobbying for that. I know that we've also looked at, within our own, the GNWT, the NWT Housing Corporation, stepping forward and actually moving those homes, and I think that it should still be on the table. But my concern is there's only a few more feet. We've got like pipes and oil drums that are actually exposed now in the pictures I've seen. I'm afraid for these people. I agree with Frida in saying that I don't know how they're sleeping. These homes are going to fall into the ocean, and it's not just about putting a barricade. They're on big cliffs. So I don't think we have time to wait. And so I really hope that the people in TUC will hear our pleas and my concern, my deep concern. As if I'm elected as premier, then I will commit to actually going into the community and try to talk to those people. I'll talk to the NWT Housing Corporation, and if the federal government isn't going to step up, then we have to be willing to provide homes for those people, recognizing some of them can't be moved, perhaps. But we have to have a solution, and contrary to what you might want to hear, I do not think the solution is leaving those homes on the edge of a cliff when there's only 2 feet left. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Ms. Cochran. Next question, we have Ms. Wozniak.
Deputy ministers oversee the delivery and implementation of government priorities by the public service. And by law, deputy ministers are appointed on the recommendation of a premier. Will you commit to seeking and relying on input from cabinet or possibly from the other MLAs before making those recommendations? Thank you.
Merci, Ms. Wozniak. The order for responses will be Mr. Simpson, Ms. Cochran, Mr. Lafferty, and Ms. Martzellos. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, the Premier of the Northwest Territories, or the Premier, sorry, I'll slow down for the translators, I apologize. The Premier in a consensus government system has less power than in a party-based system. One of the few powers is to appoint deputy ministers. And so I think it's an important power for the Premier to hold. However, as we've seen today, just from the question period, there's a diverse array of expertise in this room, and I think there's nothing wrong with consulting with cabinet ministers about a potential deputy minister, and I would be happy to do that. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There are certain positions that within Cabinet that I believe should be maintained in Cabinet. For example, the Principal Secretary. That position is critical to the Premier. It's a person of trust. It's a person that ideally can build relationships. So because that person is so vital to the working of the Premier, I think that has to remain within the Premier's perusal. Deputy Ministers, I think we're open to feedback. I think that it should be, if at the least, a cabinet decision, that a decision that were made in cabinet that we talk about. I think we should be open to feedback from MLAs as well. But ultimately, it does have to be a decision that's made based on the best needs of all departments versus personalities. So I'm open to hearing all members' opinions, but I also would require that sound reasoning be provided behind every comment and recommendation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, deputies, ministers of the JNWT, obviously, as member alluded to, they deal with the priorities that we give them, the mandate to implement and rely on cabinet. Before making a decision on DMs from the Premier, I believe it's been done in the past when I was a minister. Premier of the day would give us a heads up that there's changes in deputies. What's your thoughts? And so there's been some engagement in the past. Maybe they got away from that last assembly, I'm not sure, but I think it's we need to continue to have that, because we're all as a team, Premier and Executive, the cabinet ministers. So once there's changes coming with the deputies, cabinet should be informed that there's changes coming down, and they might have some ideas as well. So I think we need to be open-minded as well. Merci.
Merci, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Martzellos.
I think it's really important that the deputy ministers are appointed by the Premier and with input from cabinet. And I think that we always make sure that we have the best, and we ensure that they're there to serve the members of the Northwest Territories, the people of the Northwest Territories, to the very best of the ability, and to make sure the decisions and the priorities that Cabinet and members around this House have made as priorities, and they carry out that function. And I think that trust within with the Premier and the Cabinet is extremely important, that we make sure that we always make sure that we have the very best to serve the people of the Northwest Territories.
Merci, Ms. Marcellos. Next question, Mr. O'Reilly.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. We've even heard today here a number of different competing priorities in terms of large capital projects, such as Tolson, which will be, if it was to expand it to its full extent, over $1 billion. Slade Geological Province Road, probably over $1 billion as well. Universal childcare, $25 million a year. That's what a feasibility study said at the end of the last assembly. So we've got a bunch of competing capital projects, as well as some programs and services that we can decide on. So I'd like to know from each of the Premier candidates how they intend to put in place an evidence-based decision-making process so that we can make the best decisions possible amongst these competing interests. Merci.
Merci, Mr. O'Reilly. We will have Ms. Cochran, Ms. Marcellos, Mr. Simpson, and then Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Evidence-based process is about best practices, and it's about proper planning. And so I talked in my speech about doing a 10-year economic development plan, a strategy, and then a 4-year action plan based off of that. Within that process, you would be looking at all of the expenditures, all of the potential revenues, and then from that process, looking at risk management is critical within that. What are the risks? What could happen if the worst happened? And then from that actually process, we'd be able to make an informed decision. However, at the same time, I've also made a commitment to work with regional Indigenous governments to actually look at our economic development plans for regionally. The reality is even when we get to that work done, it doesn't mean that everything is going to start at the same time. It's a matter of defining what would be best for the regions, for the Indigenous governments, for the people, and then negotiating amongst all of us about it. So it's priority setting about which one comes first, which ones can wait, which ones are critical. So I don't think that's a process that should be done exclusive. I think it should be inclusive. And again, if I'm selected as Premier, then we will have a solid, evidence-based strategic economic plan and action plan for the GNWT, and we would be building regional economic development plans with every Indigenous government. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Ms. Cochran. Ms. Marcellos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That is a really good question. I think that with our deficit the way it is, and planning for the future, for future generations, that the priorities of this House, when we examine them next week and beyond, must be dealt with all the members. And our priorities will be set, and Cabinet will have to lobby to make sure that the federal government also steps up to the plate, which is possible, because in most capital items such as green energy, when you come to the Tolson, for example, most of that could be paid by the Government of Canada. We're sustaining communities for economic development, and it's a big project that needs to be done in order for us to move forward economically. And that's the only way we're going to start moving forward, is when we start ensuring that the funds are going to be there for some of these major priorities. And I'm very good at lobbying. Never take no for an answer. I always take a half no or a half yes. But I've been there, have done that, and I will continue to do that when I become your next premier. Thank you.
Merci, Ms. Martzelos. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and I appreciate the question. My speech earlier today focused on changes that could be made by the Premier, not so much in broad changes, but the specific items like this, and I think this is exactly the type of thing that needs to be done. A lot of the times, as politicians, we're not experts on everything, so we make decisions based on our gut, and I don't think that is a good way to make decisions, especially when you're talking about billion-dollar projects. I know the government of the Northwest Territories is, just looking through their literature, has basically already said we're doing Tulsin, and here's the steps we're taking to get there. But they haven't found a market. We haven't seen any cost projections, any revenue projections. We don't know what they're going to do in terms of, and no one does, in terms of revenue they could receive from any potential future mines. And so we need to think more about this type of information before we start signing checks. Not that we wouldn't sign the check, but we need the information. We also need to look deeper into investment funding, I guess is a way to put it. Funding that might not pay off in the term of this assembly, might not pay off for 20 or 30 years, but it needs to be done. Things like early childhood intervention, early childhood education, those types of things that I wish the governments would have done 30 years ago. You know, we need to start projecting, doing those type of projections as well. So I'm happy the member brought this up, and as I stated earlier as well, these sort of evolutionary improvements to how we do business won't stop after people are sworn into office. They should continually be brought forward, and if they need to be implemented, then we implement them. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Madam Chair. Madam Chair,
Madam Chair, there's a lot of, in our region, there's a lot of big capital investment going on right now. As O'Reilly mentioned, there's two big items that are going, that is being produced. But right now we have to look at it first to see, is there enough evidence to make proper planning for whatever project is most important. And regional cooperation, how are they going to be, what are they working on, and how are they going to be helping? And if we don't have that, or can we try something? Is there in another place, how does it look? Like right now, for an example, in Nunavut province corridor, there's there is a highway, and the caribou are going to go onto the road. So we have to think about all the issues of each project and make sure that we know exactly what is required. Then we can make a proper decision. There's short-term and long-term project, and then there is other long-term projects that would take us up to 10 years maybe. And how are we going to implement all these, and then how we're going to implement it and maintain it. After a big capital project is worked on, we have to figure out which one is most important to us. So we say, in Clinchon, when we say billion, we say million, which is a billion. So that's how much monies that we have to think about. Merci, Mr. Lafferty. Mr. Johnson? Zond,
made, the senior management at the GNWT cannot make them. In turn, once cabinet positions are assigned, each person is responsible for their individual department. The Premier is the sole minister responsible for executive and Indigenous affairs, and as such, his primary responsibility is to work across departments. The biggest issues we are facing in this territory require us to work across departments. If you are Premier, how will you work to break down the silos amongst our GNWT departments?
Mr. Johnson. We'll start with Ms. Martselos, then Mr. Lafferty, then Ms. Cochran, and Mr. Simpson. Ms. Martselos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think cooperation in between departments is extremely important. In leadership, you have to make tough decisions. And when we make decisions, we have to always realize that it affects the decisions that we're actually making. It affects everybody because yesterday we had this forum, and obviously some of the decisions that were being made were not okay. They were not okay to the Indigenous people. So I think not only the departments, but also in the leadership role, that you have to be able to listen. You have to have an open door policy. You have to build partnerships. You have to have the necessary contact to ensure that the delivery is done properly. You have to be thorough, because many times you give direction, and this happens many times even at other levels of government. You give direction, and the direction was never taken properly, and then your partner that you're trying to serve, who might be another Indigenous government, everything was not the way it was supposed to be in the first place. So we have to make sure that when we give direction to senior management, that the direction is very clear, and it's the way it should have been for the people that we serve, whether it be the whole Northwest Territories, whether it be for Indigenous governments, whether it be with the private sector, whether it be other levels of government. But we have to ensure that we always understand that the decisions that are made at this level affects the people that we're serving. And I think if you are able to understand that and be reasonable about it and keep an open mind and think out of the box, I think that we could be successful. Thank you.
Merci, Ms. Martselos. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Madam Chair.
To work across the departments. We should not be working in silos. There should be synergy, that we need to be collaborating, cooperation between all departments. We currently have social envelope. We have economic arm envelope as well. Those departments should be working hand in hand so they can split the wealth. What I mean by that is there's funding available to each department. And they can pool that funding together to service the small communities, other communities. I think that will go a long way. We've been doing that for some time. I think we need to do more of that. And so with like Justice Department and education, there's been programs in our schools that we've been creative of having mental health into our schools. So Health Department came in along the way as well to deal with issues. And RCMP obviously took part in that too. So it's all interrelated, like interagency. And there are some interagencies in the communities that we need to work with as well. They consist of RCMP, health, community nurses, teachers, and community members as well. So we need to take their advice too. And I'm not sure if all communities have them, but the communities that have interagencies, that we should continue working with them, and because they are the experts giving us advice and feedback, that our departments should be listening to them and then providing some support, whether it be resources and so forth. So, Madam Chair, I believe that we shouldn't be working in silos. We should be collaborating, working together. Merci.
Merci, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the regular members do have standing committees, such as social issues, economy, etc. Cabinet also has committees. So we have the same Social Issues Committee, which I sit on. Actually, I sit on all of them, actually. Economy, environment. So we have a number of committees that actually cabinet ministers sit on. And just like standing committee, any cabinet minister is welcome at any time to attend any committee, even if you're not on the list. We also have deputy minister committees with the same social agendas, economic development, environment, economy, etc. So those things need to be continued, and I don't take credit for that. That's something that the previous or the premier of the day is done, and I think that's a great idea. But I think we're still missing the point. The big thing that I find, and I found that over the 4 years, is that our meetings are so structured all the time. They're very agenda-filled. So we come into these committee meetings and we've got a huge agenda, and we deal with the agenda, and then we say there's a place on it that says mandate commitments, and we all say, look at the mandates, make sure you're doing your job, and that's kind of it. And then at the end of the assembly, we all stress and say, did we make those mandate commitments? So I think we need to bump it up. It's about relationships. I've said that all day. Everybody said that all day. And so looking at the possibility, if we're going to really work together, should we have more working groups with MLAs and ministers combined? That's a good question. Should we actually, because we have a Minister of Transparency at this point, don't know if it'll stay, Cabinet will discuss those things, but should we actually make that part of that position that they actually check on the mandates on a regular basis? Does there need to be somebody, and I think there might need to be, somebody that actually looks at the mandates on a regular basis and makes sure that the departments, because the mandates are not one department, it's all departments working together to match priority. So maybe we need to have somebody accountable to that actually is responsible for it, so we're not scrambling at the end of an assembly and saying, have we met our mandates? Working together and making people responsible. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. This, again, I spoke about this at length in my speech today. This is one of the areas that the Premier can affect and needs to affect. The lack of collaboration that often happens or doesn't happen between departments affects the GNWT itself, because one department can't do its job because it can't get information from another department, and it affects service delivery. It affects how people, whether they're dealing with finance or whatever the case may be, it affects how they receive services. So some of the solutions I suggested were having a policy development unit accountable and that reports to the cabinet directly, similar to the model that is used for standing committees, adapted as necessary though. The other thing I suggest is actually using the deputy ministers as management tools that they are, utilizing their skills in managing their departments and tasking them with ensuring that their departments are cooperating. Often the information that comes up to the minister, it's filtered through a lot of people, and the deputy minister is one of those people, but the information is also filtered through people before it gets to the deputy minister. So that's why I also suggested having a feedback loop where the decision makers know what is actually happening on the ground. They know if people are getting information, because as a regular member, we get a report that says everything's fine. You talk to someone on the ground, things aren't fine. And so there needs to be a way that information makes it up to the ministers as well. So we need to task the deputy ministers with ensuring their departments are breaking down silos, are sharing information appropriately, and are working together. And there's legislation that has to be followed. There's privacy legislation that might have to be followed, and the last government actually made amendments to that to allow that to happen. So we are taking steps in that direction, but it just comes down to doing it and following up on it and knowing that it's actually done. We can't just say, let's break down silos, and, months later say, how's that silo breaking down going? We need to do our jobs, essentially. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. I believe we have 2 more people on the list for questions. Ms. Cheney next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Mackenzie Valley is will significantly affect the Sahtu region, both positively and negatively. The economic development and access to our natural resources will be also significant and will open up lands for development. But also will come the social impacts. The social impacts will also be dramatically seen. Currently, right now, they do exist. But then once the highway is developed, the bridge is put in, and then there's other talks of how are we going to be working towards this project. It's been in the talks for years. So presently, right now, in preparation for the Mackenzie Valley Highway, what are your plans to work towards the forecasted social impacts that may occur in regards to this project?
Merci, Ms. Chin. We will start with Mr. Lafferty, then Ms. Cochran, Mr. Simpson, and then Ms. Martzelos. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci. Madam Chair,
once the highway is open to the communities, I agree with what she said. There's a lot of things that come with all-weather road. We have a lot of social issues that will come into the communities regarding drugs and alcohol. A lot of social impacts. Once a road is in the community, and it also affects the animal, the wildlife, and their food. But when an all-weather road is made, before that, we need to look at a lot of things, how that community will be impacted. We talked about this all-weather road for a long time, and they collected and they did their own research and asked the communities, and they talked about how it will impact them, whether it's a negative things regarding alcohol and drugs. Also, with the young people, it increased the social problems in the community. Right now, the Territorial region is working on the all-weather road, and they did question the young people. And I think education awareness is very important, and also have certain programs in place to help the communities, and even the road to Inuvik to Tuk, and also the same as the Sahtu region and Mackenzie Valley. We need to think about these things. Once we have all-weather road to our community, we need to do an education awareness way before this happens. So it's important that that happens. So we need to prepare and do research before any of these come into place. It's like this. It's like advising each other and questioning each other. And that this is what happened. Merci, Madam Chair.
Merci, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In all honesty, that's probably the hardest question I've heard today. Social impacts of any kind of infrastructure are huge. I'm from Yellowknife, and I remember when the diamond mines came, and like I said, I've worked for over 20 years with homeless people, and I've seen the STIs increase. I've seen teen pregnancy explode. I've seen rapes happening constantly. I've seen more addictions happening. I've seen violence, women getting beat all the time. I don't have the answer. I wish I could say. The answer would be you have all the programs, all the supports in every community to address them. We don't have that, so I'm not going to lie to you. I think that the only thing we can do at this time is education, education, education. Let the communities know that this is what they're going to be dealing with. Talk to the youth, talk to the family members, try to let people put it on the radio. put places, call for help if you're in trouble. But this is going to take a huge amount of resources to be able to do that for every major infrastructure project that we did in the Northwest Territories, and it will take time to solve. So all I can put at this point, and I'm open to more suggestions because I would love to have the answer that's feasible, but at this point it's only the best I can offer based on my own experience working with homeless women and low-income families, is try to let them know what's coming. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Next, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and I appreciate that bringing the point up and the question. It's an excellent question, and it's the kind of things that, a lot of the issues we have in the territory, they became issues a long time ago, and we're trying to deal with them. The social impacts that, likely, unless we do something, would arise from the Mackenzie Valley Highway are something that we can deal with right now. We can take preventative measures, and I think that's important, and that's something that, like I said, I've been an MLA for 4 years. I wish things were done 30 years ago that we're talking about now. And so this is our opportunity to do that, and we can learn from the road to Tuck, and we can learn from the road to Wati and what's being done. And I know earlier I said that it's going to bring tourism and industry up the valley, but with those things comes problems, comes issues. If you have 10,000 vehicles now coming up the highway, there are issues with that. And so those things really do need to be mitigated, and again, it is partnering with the Indigenous governments, with the local communities. It's not something the GNWT can necessarily take a lead on. The communities know the communities, but it's something that the GNWT absolutely has to be a part of and support. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Marcellos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that's a really good question. Okay, the social impacts when you're dealing with major developments, especially the Mackenzie Valley Highway, and I think one way of dealing with some of that is the economic growth that it will bring, and with regards to resources and some of those other that comes with development, is the impact benefit agreements. And the impact benefit agreements that you will receive from some of the developments in your area or other areas around along the highway should be spent on preventative measures, awareness programs, making sure that the people understand that there is help available, and enforcement. Enforcement is a big, major issue in every community. Many of us feel that lots of times, even in Fort Smith, the RCMP are invisible. They're not visible. And I think that those are some of the things that we've got to address when you do a development of any kind. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci, Ms. Marcellos. Ms. Cochran.
Sorry, I missed the question.
For our final question of today, we have Mr. Norton.
Oh. I need some water. I haven't hardly spoke today. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, yesterday when we were at the Leaders Roundtable, we were told by some of the leadership that to not to forget our small communities. And that was important. Now it kind of hit home because, I feel like a lot of small communities feel like they're being left behind by our larger centers. In this day and age, there's no reason why some of our smaller communities should go without adequate communication systems, i.e. high-speed internet access. There was recently a new fiber optic cable installed at bypass Lutzke, but connected other communities. And this has business and education implications. Say you couldn't teleconference and then you're forced to fly out, for example. Or if you want to take an online learning course, it's a little bit difficult to do that if you have really slow internet. And even during my door-to-door there, when I was trying to get out to communicate out to even to my family, it was very difficult to communicate. It was very slow. So My question to the Premier candidates is, if elected, what will you do as a Premier to ensure that all our small communities have adequate communication systems that are on par with our larger centers? Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Norn. We will begin with Mr. Simpson, then Ms. Martzelos, Ms. Cochran, and Mr. Lafferty. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and once again, the Premier can promote items that this Assembly brings forward as priorities, and I hope that that is one of the priorities. I see the value in high-speed internet in terms of education, in terms of entrepreneurship, and I hope that the Assembly sees the same thing. There is federal money in order to help expand some of these services to the communities that we should be accessing. There's partnerships available with companies, although we have to see how those would work out. There are a lot of opportunities to put this fiber in, and we even need to start looking at whether or not communities can start owning that infrastructure themselves and possibly using that to generate income. I know it's hard, it's expensive in the territory because of our geography, and that it's a difficulty to access on the line because it's owned by a private company. But those are the kind of things we need to start looking at, because I am completely in favor of connecting all of our communities and bringing us all into the 21st century. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. Ms. Martzelos.
I think we ought to look at all the options, because communications is extremely important. In this day and age, anywhere in the world, and especially in the north here, communications is extremely important. We don't even have cell service from between Hay River and Fort Smith. If it's minus 45 outside, we can't phone anyone. And if you're traveling at night, it becomes a dangerous situation. I think we have also a monopoly in the north with Northwest Tel, and I think that we have to have a discussion and bring them into that discussion. They have an obligation to the north, and we pay lots for all these services that they offer, some of the larger communities, and I think that there has to be a discussion on how we can improve to make sure that the communities are served, and look at other options if that doesn't work. Thank you.
Merci, Ms. Martzelos. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like people have been saying, it's important to listen. Telecommunications technology is not one of my strengths. People know that. I work well with computer, but I'm not a computer programmer. I'm not a thing. Luckily enough, my partner is. So my partner actually worked in Northwest Tel for 30-some years and just retired. So he talks a lot about this stuff. Basically, to be able to, the idea of actually being able to put it and communities having ownership of it, my belief is, based on my learning, is that it's not feasible. It's too expensive. That Northwest Tel currently is actually subsidizing the small communities. They're not making money at it. So we have to be realistic with that. It's a private business. If we take that on, are we willing to look at the deficit? However, what I'm saying is that it's not okay not to have nothing. So what I've been promoting, again, I haven't thought about taking on the whole ownership, putting everything full force into the communities, because I don't know if that's feasible or cost effective, or if it will be one of our priorities. But what I can say is that we have Northern Distance Learning going into the communities, into high schools. This year, I believe there'll be 22 communities that will be linked with our Northern Distance Learning. The GNWT, Department of Education, Culture and Employment, pays for extra bandwidth. I don't know what bandwidth is, but I know that we're paying for extra bandwidth to actually get into those schools. So I have asked my partner, I've asked the department, and my understanding is feasible, is if we are using that extra bandwidth into the schools, why can't we extend that to our post-secondary using those 21 community learning centers? That's what I talk about, strong community learning centers. So if it's only a little bit more bandwidth, pay for it if it's feasible, because again, it's not my strength. if it's feasible, and start with that so that the education is appropriate. Education, I've heard from all of us, from the Indigenous governments around this table, that it's a priority. So let's start with our children, which we're doing in our high schools. Let's expand that so people can get more options for post-secondary. And as for developing it for the whole community or taking it on to the community as a potential, I don't see it as a social enterprise, I see it as a social deficit. Those are discussions that I'm open to feedback on because I don't know the answers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Ms. Cochrane. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, that fiber optic line that was built along the Mackenzie Valley, unfortunately, it didn't connect to all communities, as it should. And we need to build on that as a fiber optic line, connecting to the communities along the way. And there are other announcements as well. Northwest Hill, it was in the newspaper, that they're connecting under Grace Slave Lake onto the communities. So we need to sit down with the head of Northwest Hill and find out what their plan is. Are they going to be connecting all communities or just some communities? How can we be partner with them? Because I heard on the radio that obviously they'll be seeking out sponsor support from GNWT. Well, we're here today. We need to meet with them. So those are discussions that we need to have at the high level. And so it has to be comparable and compatible to larger centers. Small communities should not be left out, as we heard yesterday from small community representatives. And this is an opportunity for us to connect all communities with fiber optic lines, so we have a high-speed internet that's compatible to larger centers. So I fully support that as well. We need to sit down and talk about the initiatives undergo with Mackenzie Valley Fiber Optic, building on that, and also Northwest Hill. So those are discussions that we need to have. Merci.
Merci, Mr. Lafferty. I have no further questions on the list for today. So, merci to all the members. It has been a long and full day. I know many of you are traveling home this weekend, and I wish you all the safe travels. The Territorial Leadership Committee will reconvene at 9 a.m. on Thursday, October 24th. I want to remind members that our orientation program will continue at 6 p.m. on Monday evening in the caucus room. Monday is also the federal election, so we can keep one eye on the results and the other on our work. Thank you, members, and we are adjourned.